Okay, now let's look at nested or composite evaluations, right? Where I have a function evaluated for another function, right? So we're going to say evaluate each expression, show each step of your process. Now you can find this information on page 443 and 447 of the textbook that we're using in class, but here's our evaluation. Well, how do we set this up? Well, we start with what angle has a sine ratio of -1/2. Right? Well, we know that the sine is negative in the third and the fourth quadrant. Right? So I need to think of my reference angle. My reference angle is pi/6. But I also have to recall that the output of my inverse sine is between -pi/2 and pi/2. So that means that this becomes the cosine of -pi/6, because that's the output of the inverse sine. And what is the cosine of -pi/6? Well, whether I use my reference sheet or I have memorized my unit circle, that answer would be √3/2. So I've evaluated the expression, I've shown each step of the process. And once again, recall that the inverse sine has outputs restricted between -pi/2 and pi/2. Okay. What about this next one? Pause the video, try it out on your own, come back, unpause the video, and see how you've done. Okay. You always get better by trying. Did you pause the video? Well, here we have the inverse cosine of -√2/2. So we can think of this as saying, hey, what angle has a trig ratio, a cosine ratio of -√2/2? Well, we know that the cosine is negative in quadrant 2 and quadrant 3. We know that our reference angle is pi/4. So we have to think about what's going to be my answer. Right? Well, recall that the cosine is going to be between 0 and pi. So we need an angle between 0 and pi for this, which means we're going to have the angle from starting position up to there. That's going to be between 0 and pi. What is that angle? 3pi/4. Okay. Well, what's the sine of 3pi/4? The sine of 3pi/4 is √2/2. So there I have the evaluation of my expression. Right? And once again, I have to recall that I am having this restriction for my inverse cosine. My inverse cosine between 0 and pi, my inverse sine between -pi/2 and pi/2. Very, very important to get the practice. Make sure that you're taking the time to practice and asking questions for clarification.